But that's not what diplomacy is. The role, they say the definition of a diplomat is someone who can tell you to go to hell in such a way that you feel you're going to enjoy the journey. So all this shouting and name-calling, that's not diplomacy. That's primitive. So 2,000 years ago, our ancestors were much smarter than us. They understood what diplomacy was. In the 21st century, we don't understand what diplomacy is. And paradoxically, even though Western culture prides itself on its openness, right? That's what liberalism is about. I'm open, I'm liberal. Actually, the Western mind finds it very difficult to deal with an other, which is very, very different.
Doing diplomacy in a stable world is different from doing diplomacy in an increasingly unstable world.
Well, see, fortunately, we can learn from the wisdom of the ages. And as you know, diplomacy is the world's second oldest profession. No relationship to the oldest profession, by the way. And the people who lived 2,000 years ago were smarter than the people who are living today. And I'll give you a simple example. In the old days, 2,000 years ago, when tribes or states would fight each other, they would then try to negotiate, and then they would send an ambassador to the enemy capital, and then the ruler would get angry and chop off the head of the ambassador. That stopped the negotiations, obviously.
Right.
So they realized, they came to the common sense conclusion, hang on a second, if we chop off heads of ambassadors, then clearly you cannot have diplomacy. So they created the concept of diplomatic immunity. And that's how it began 2,000 years ago, so that ambassadors could go into enemy courts and not get their heads chopped off. So diplomacy was always invented to talk to enemies, not to friends. Now the reason why I say that there were people 2,000 years ago were smarter than us is that in the 21st century, well, at least here in the United States, you have the belief that before I can establish diplomatic relations with you, you've got to be my friend. But you don't need diplomatic relations for a friend. If you're going to a friendly court, your head is not going to get chopped off. But once you declare a country is an enemy, then you've got to establish diplomatic relations. So therefore, logically, as you know, vis-a-vis North Korea, which the United States declares to be an enemy state, it should establish diplomatic relations. That's the logical thing to do. But you notice that it cannot be done because it's politically incorrect. And I'll give you another example of politically incorrect diplomacy. And my apologies to some of you if here I'm treading on sensitive ground. When you had the first meeting between Secretary Blinken and foreign ministers of China, Jiang Jiechi and Wang Yi, soon after the Biden administration was elected, I think in Alaska, And the meeting began with both sides attacking each other. And why did they attack each other? For domestic political reasons, right? But that's not what diplomacy is. The role, they say the definition of a diplomat is someone who can tell you to go to hell in such a way that you feel you're going to enjoy the journey. So all this shouting and name-calling, that's not diplomacy. That's primitive. So 2,000 years ago, our ancestors were much smarter than us. They understood what diplomacy was. In the 21st century, we don't understand what diplomacy is. And when you talk about a multipolar world has been the norm since human history began. When you have a unipolar moment like the one between the end of the Cold War and probably next 20 years, that was an aberration. A unipolar world, bipolar world are all aberrations. The 21st century will be a multipolar world. And in a multipolar world, you've got to deal with complexity. You've got to deal with people who think and completely different from you. And that's why you need to go back to the old tenets of diplomacy. So tenet number one, if you're my enemy, first thing I do, I establish diplomatic relations with you. So I can see you, talk to you face to face and understand what you really think. Because I can assure you, unless you are there in the enemy capital, talking to everyone, you don't understand how they really think. You got to be there. Whether it's Iran, whether it's North Korea, whether it's any country. And then at the same time, you got to accept the reality that in all good diplomacy is about compromise. If any country tries to get everything, it's not going to succeed. So they should make it a truism for diplomacy that if any country goes for total security, it is creating total insecurity. Because if you have total security, your neighbor, your counterpart is not secure. What you want is a situation where both sides feel secure. That requires compromise between US and China, between India and China, between North Korea and South Korea, between all countries. You need to have compromise and learn to live and give and take. And actually, you know what? They've been doing it for thousands of years, but we've lost it. In the 21st century.
We're increasingly incapable.
we have become very ideological as human animals. And especially in the West, there's a great desire to pass judgment on countries and say, how can I possibly establish diplomatic relations with the Taliban? Well, you have to establish diplomatic relations with the Taliban because they're different, right?
I think part of the challenge is the public scrutiny that wasn't there 2,000 years ago.
No, but the public scrutiny should be intelligent public scrutiny and should insist that at the end of the day, we are going to move into a much more smaller, more interdependent world. And I always use a simple boat analogy just to describe how the world has changed. In the past, when 8 billion people lived in 193 separate countries, it was as though they were 193 separate boats, right? And the proof of that was if one boat caught COVID, another boat wouldn't catch COVID. COVID cannot go from boat to boat. But now, the 8 billion people no longer live in 193 separate boats. They live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. So that's why COVID goes from cabin to cabin. All 193 cabins got COVID. Now, if you live in a small interdependent universe all together, it's not just about protecting your cabin. You've got to protect the boat as a whole. You've got to protect planet Earth as a whole. And now with climate change coming, the most important priority in diplomacy today should be, hey, first let's save our planet before we continue fighting each other. That should be the priority.
I completely agree on the need for that shared direction, a shared interest in tackling this existential challenge together. But I think intellectually we all understand that, but on a day-to-day foreign policy thinking and diplomatic practice, the short-term interest gets in the way, the short-term national interest. You mentioned India and China. We had the Indian foreign minister here just 2 weeks ago, and he exuded a great deal of confidence about India's rise. I think India is growing at 8% annually. Think of India growing at 8% for decades to come, and think how you're going to deal with that India, right?
Yeah, I noticed that Asia Society only likes Indians. Jai Shakhar's Indian, I'm Indian.
No,
They're only Indians here.
No,
you should invite some Chinese also.
we welcome all Asian leaders.
I'm kidding.
No. But so we asked him about India-China relations.
Yeah.
China is not doing so well these days. It's a bit of an economic downturn that seems hard to overcome. But India-China relations is difficult, and how the two sides manage this will be, a definitive influence on the rest of Asia,
sure,
and the world perhaps. So how do you see that unfolding? How do you advise the two sides to manage this relationship?
Well, the way I describe it, I say that relations between China and India, they're not bad. They're very bad. No, seriously, I'm very, very worried. If there's one big thing that I worry about the future of Asia and about the future of the Asian century, is how these two Asian giants will get on, China and India. And actually, for most of the time, they were able to get along reasonably well. And indeed, when Prime Minister Modi came into office in 2014, I think, he had much longer meetings with President Xi Jinping than any other Indian leader had. And then, unfortunately, we had a very bad incident in Galwan in June 2020, where both Chinese and Indian soldiers lost their lives in a clash. And since then, relations have gone down. And I'm sure, as Foreign Minister Jaishankar hinted, relations are in a very difficult phase. So, but at the same time, if China and India look at it logically, they both have tremendous growth potential. You're right in saying that Chinese economy is facing some short-term challenges, but I can assure you 10 years from now, the Chinese economy will be much, much bigger than what it is today. And 10 years from now, the Indian economy will be much, much bigger than it is today. And a former Prime Minister of India, Manmohan Singh, once said very wisely, he said the sky is big enough for both China and India to grow together. So, and I think that's the case. It's a question of both of them having to achieve a new modus vivendi with each other. And I think it can be done. We'll have to go back to the old-fashioned diplomacy of 2,000 years ago, where you compromise and you can work things out.
And what about ASEAN in that mix?
Well, I think ASEAN is the most underrated organization in the world. It has performed absolute miracles, okay? It has taken the most diverse region of planet Earth, Southeast Asia. By the way, just take a mental tour, all of you, to Latin America, to Africa, to Europe, to Central Asia. Go any part of the world, you'll never find the kind of diversity as you do in Southeast Asia, where out of 700 million people, you have 250 million Muslims, 150 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, you have Taoists, you have Confucianists, you have Hindus, and you have lots of communists also in Southeast Asia. 100 million of them. So, you know, we have everything in Southeast Asia. It's the most diverse region. If there was one region of the world that was destined for war, it's Southeast Asia, right? And British historians call it the Balkans of Asia. But guess what? We've had, since 1967, the creation of ASEAN, we've had peace and prosperity. And ASEAN's economy has grown spectacularly. In the year 2000, Japan's economy was 8 times bigger than ASEAN. Now it's 1.3 times bigger than ASEAN. And by 2030, ASEAN's bigger than Japan. So this is a remarkable region. At the same time, to answer your broader question, ASEAN is playing also an important role of bringing other powers to come and talk to each other under the ASEAN umbrella. So you notice that the annual ASEAN meetings, which I think you attended, as you know them quite well, Keng Hua. You notice how when the ASEAN countries meet, they invite everybody, and everybody comes. And that's amazing. No other region attracts so many foreign participants as ASEAN meetings do. So it shows you the convening power that ASEAN has. And the first way, by the way, the first lesson in diplomacy is that you got to talk to each other. You know, nowadays, there's still many countries where the heads of state can't talk to each other. Whereas if you come to an ASEAN meeting, everybody talks to each other. That's what ASEAN does.
So this notion of ASEAN centrality, the first I came across it was almost the same time when this notion of the Indo-Pacific replacing the Asia-Pacific as a geographical framing of the order came about. And I think it was, in fact, Prime Minister Modi who said ASEAN centrality, the centrality of ASEAN in the Indo-Pacific. I first heard it from him, and then it became ASEAN's own term as it's spelled out as Indo-Pacific outlook. Is that is that more of an, the aspirational side of it? And I think it would be great for that centrality to have the strongest substance it can have in terms of the internal solidarity and togetherness. But there is a great deal of difference, economic difference, political difference within the 10 ASEAN countries, and now to be 11 to include East Timor.
Yes.
So how do you then internally deal with the diversity, the huge gaps, for example, in terms of the economic conditions of the countries?
You're right. ASEAN is the most diverse regional organization. And in fact, if there's one regional organization where members should be squabbling with each other, it should be ASEAN. But what's remarkable, there is very little squabbling within ASEAN. And I know I wrote a book called The ASEAN Miracle. And one thing, we still don't fully understand why ASEAN is successful, by the way. But one fundamental reason could be because of Indonesia. Because traditionally, most regional organizations fail because the largest member state tries to control the other states. I mean, it happens in the Organization of American States, OAS, which is dysfunctional, Whereas Indonesia, as the largest member state of ASEAN, hasn't tried to dominate ASEAN. But more importantly, within Indonesia, the most populous people are the Javanese. And the Javanese have this concept of musyawarah and mufakat, which means consultation and consensus. That you don't fight each other. You consult each other, you talk to each other, and you reach a consensus. And somehow or other, the Indonesians have planted the DNA of musyawarah and mufakat into ASEAN. So there's consultation and consensus within ASEAN. And ASEAN is a very loose organization. The reason why you had Brexit in the European Union is that the Europeans have a rule: you're either in or you're out. So you've got to abide by all the EU regulations, or you use it. Whereas in the case of ASEAN, we are a bit more flexible. We say, if you're not happy, take a vacation. Come back. So, we have this ASEAN minus X principle. So if you cannot all agree, okay, maybe 7 of us agree, the 3 of you take your time. When you're ready, you can come and join us. So that kind of looseness and flexibility. So the European Union was wise. They should have given UK a vacation. and sure enough, the British people now deeply regret the decision. But because they're so rigid and legalistic, they cannot come back in.
Yes.
So this is where ASEAN can teach Europe some lessons.
Before I give the floor to the audience, I have to, of course, ask you about the current situation in the Middle East. I mean, we're talking about Asia rising, optimistic, but we have these terrible wars going on in other parts of the... And, of course, the headlines these days are all about Israel, Hezbollah, Lebanon, and Iran. How do you see this ending?
Well, I've been studying geopolitics for 53 years. And, and as you know, I make pronouncements on lots of subjects confidently, even though I may not know much about it. But I've decided very early on that there's one area which is a complete exception, which is the Middle East. Because in every other region of the world, I can try to understand the structural dynamics. And if I understand the structural dynamics, then I can more or less predict what's going to happen, right? The Middle East is a very strange corner of the world where if you can find the happy, peaceful way or the ugly, confrontational way, they'll always pick the ugly, confrontational way. I don't know why. For reasons I really don't understand. And that's why that region, in my 53 years of studying geopolitics, there have been more wars in the Middle East than anywhere else. Wars, skirmishes, all kinds of challenges and so on and so forth. And absolutely no movement towards any kind of regional harmony. It's the exact opposite of ASEAN, the Middle East. And so, but I don't understand this at all. I don't understand what in the cultural DNA of that region leads to the highest level of dysfunctionality, whereby you cannot even have normal diplomatic relations among many countries. Which is the base. The base should be just normal diplomatic relations, especially among enemies. But that cannot be done.
I think there's a...
And by contrast, just to illustrate this, when I was ambassador here in the UN in the 1980s, I spent my 5 years arguing with the Vietnamese ambassador at every General Assembly, condemning Vietnam for its occupation of Cambodia, 1980s. You know what? By the 1990s, Vietnam, which had been fighting ASEAN for so long, joined ASEAN. I mean, that's amazing. That's a miracle, right? That's what we do in Southeast Asia. We take a long-standing enemy, and we say, okay, now you're part of the family. That's it. That's something as simple as that. Can you imagine the Middle East doing this? That's why there's something wrong in the cultural DNA of that region. And anybody who makes predictions about what's going to happen in the Middle East is very stupid. Seriously, because you believe me, that region will continue to surprise you. Because when you think you hit rock bottom and things cannot get worse, Middle East will always produce another rock bottom. That's how bad it is.
In the meanwhile, I think there's so much resentment and the sense of victimhood on all sides that have become so deep. And so it makes it very difficult to find cool-headedness in the midst of all of that to work towards a solution. But in the meanwhile, you have people being killed, suffering
very
on
sad.
A day-to-day basis. So, that's a rare moment when Kishore doesn't have an answer. But we have about 20 minutes for you to now ask Kishore questions or provide comments. So if there are hands raised, I will go to the young gentleman on the fourth row there.
Hello, thank you very much. My name is Adam DePico. I'm a student up at Columbia, SEPA. My question is sort of based in the Indo-Pacific. What is clear, the stakes have never been this high with the increased tensions between the US and China.
Sorry?
The stakes have never been this high with the stakes never been this high with the tensions which have prevailed in the Indo-Pacific with the US and China.
US-China.
And my question sort of lies on what more can Singapore play in terms of a role to keep the guardrails of economic stability, given that if any conflict were to emerge, Singapore would no doubt be caught in the crossfires given the choke point of the Malacca Strait. Thank you.
Well, you're absolutely right. One of Singapore's biggest concerns is, not just Singapore's biggest concerns, by the way, ASEAN's biggest concerns, is being caught in the crossfire between US and China. And sadly, I hate to make this prediction because sadly many of my predictions about the rise of Asia fortunately have been correct. But this is, I'm going to make an unfortunate prediction that the US-China contest will get worse over the next 10 years. The logic is already built in. It's very clear that, and the United States has been very open about this, that it cannot accept China as a peer. So the United States is going to try and stop China, and China is going to make sure it's not stopped, and that the contest will accelerate over the next 10 years. It's going to affect all of us. And so what the best that we can do is for ASEAN to stay united and for ASEAN to send a very clear message, which it has, by the way, so far, to say that, hey, we want to be friends with United States, we want to be friends with China, we don't want to take sides. This is a contest between the two of you, but we don't want to be, get involved in this contest. And so far, that message seems to be understood in Washington, D.C. and in Beijing. And ASEAN, by the way, also does practical things to make sure that both sides understand that we want to be friends with both. So in the case of China, ASEAN's trade with China was only $40 billion in the year 2000. By 2022, it had hit $975 billion, almost $1 trillion. It was the world's largest trading relationship in 2022. So we're sending a message to China, we want to be friends with you. And on the investment front, United States has invested more in Southeast Asia than in China, Japan, South Korea, India combined. So we are telling Americans, we want you here. We want to be your friends. So that's the message that we in ASEAN are sending, and we try to be as clear and consistent about it. And we hope that that registers in both Beijing and Washington, D.C., and that they won't force the ASEAN countries, including Singapore, to take sides.
Look, the lady on the third row. Yes, there's a microphone coming. Yes, John.
I believe she stood up.
I'll be loud enough. My name is Shazia Rafi, former Secretary General of Parliamentarians for Global Action. Good to see you here again in New York, Augusta. I just wanted to ask a little bit from the experience that you had when you were on the Security Council many years ago, when the E10, were playing quite an important role in being able to deal with what is the main job of the United Nations, which is to maintain peace and security. And right now we are in a globe where two major wars are continuing to escalate, one which may even go beyond a regional war into something that is very dangerous. And the Security Council itself seems completely unable to get over the power and abuse of the veto, in a sense, being used, with its majority membership trying desperately but not able to move the council in the direction of enforcing some peace and security on both of these two regions. So I'd be interested.
Which two regions, by the way?
The war in Ukraine with Russia and the Middle East, both of which are, still raging, and that is the institution within that village council which the world is looking to, but it seems completely unable to do it. So I'd be interested in seeing, given your experience when you played a much more important role, where the E10 played a bigger role in the past, they seem to be unable to do so.
Thank you. Sadly, I thought that things were quite bad when we were in the Security Council in the year 2001, 2002, because we were in the Security Council in the build-up to the Iraq War. And the United States was trying to get the Security Council to endorse its decision to invade Iraq, and the Security Council then refused to do so. And by the way, the United States was opposed by its friends like France and Germany and on its invasion of Iraq. But it created divisions. But still, nonetheless, despite the divisions, they were still talking to each other. The ambassadors were incredibly civil and polite. And so you had Sergei Lavrov as the Russian ambassador, Jean-David Lavitte as the French ambassador, John Negroponte as the American ambassador, Jeremy Greenstock as the British ambassador, Wang Yingfan as the Chinese ambassador. But we could all talk to each other and have a conversation going and so on and so forth. And that's what diplomacy is, by the way. Today, I understand they can't talk to each other. I mean, it's that bad. I mean, you can't even have a civil conversation of any real kind. And that's why you have to now, I think the Ukraine war and the Gaza war, unfortunately, are going to carry on for a while until you get some kind of real exhaustion of the different parties. But it will also carry on because there's no conversation at all going on among the great powers in terms of any direct contacts and conversations with each other. But that's exactly why diplomacy was invented, is when you have as difficult a situation as Ukraine, is when you should talk to each other. And by the way, if you organize a diplomatic conference, don't get like-minded people to come for the conference, because that's never going to solve a problem. Diplomacy works when you're not talking to your friends, is when you're talking to your enemies. That's what diplomacy is about. So sadly, I predict that things were not going to improve in the near future in these two areas because there's no forces there trying to do something different.
Thank you. On the, I think about eighth row up with the lady on the eighth row, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Barbara Jimenez, and I'd like to just go back to the Middle East for a moment and ask you whether you think part of the problem with a conversation between the parties in the Middle East has to do with a theocracy conversing with a secular society. And both the aims of the secular society and the theocracy are at total opposite extremes. How does that conversation work?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Can a theocracy and a secular state have a conversation? Well, I think if we're going to survive the 21st century, we have to have conversations between polar opposites. Because, you know, we are moving into a completely new era of world history today, where you're going to have the rise of clearly non-Western powers, clearly. I mean, India is a non-Western power, for example, you know. And we have to learn to deal with different cultures, different civilizations. And one thing we have been able to do, let's say in Southeast Asia, is that Vietnam, for example, remains a communist state, by the way, you know, still. And, you know, Indonesia is the world's most successful Islamic democracy. But they still talk to each other. The ideology doesn't matter. What matters at the end of the day is what are your core interests on both sides and how you reconcile your core interests. And, you know, at the end of the day, even though Iran is a theocracy, Iran is also has one of the oldest civilizations, Persian civilizations in the world. And I can tell you one of the most able diplomats I ever dealt with in my life was my then Iranian counterpart in 2000, whose name is Javad Zarif. And he, you know, is a remarkable diplomat, modern, sophisticated, you know, speaks a completely modern language. And I can tell you that when he was here, some of my Jewish friends in New York said, Kishore, can you arrange a meeting for us to meet Javad? I said, sure. So I organized a meeting where they came to my house and they talked to each other. So I've seen a conversation in my house with an Iranian diplomat and members of the Jewish community trying to figure out how we understand each other better. That's what you need to do. Regardless of how different you are, you got to talk to each other. Regardless of how different you are. And paradoxically, even though Western culture prides itself on its openness, right? That's what liberalism is about. I'm open, I'm liberal. Actually, the Western mind finds it very difficult to deal with an other, which is very, very different. And strangely enough, we in Asia, we are surrounded by otherness. We are all different. I mean, Chinese and Indian civilizations are very different, very different. And in Southeast Asia, we see the merger of Chinese and Indian civilizations too. But we learn how to deal with differences. We accept the fact that we are different. And that's what we need to have in the 21st century. And understanding that whoever the other is we're dealing with is going to be very different. But that's precisely the reason why we need to talk to each other.
Okay, let's go to this side. Any hands raised here? Okay, the gentleman on the third row at the end.
Good evening, Mr. Mahbubani. I just want to add on to what you said to the lady's question on having you have diplomacy with your enemies, not with your friends, to those who are vastly different to yourself. But I was wondering, what are your thoughts on top of that, bringing these very different actors together, both in diplomacy, but also on something on a higher level like economic development or scientific advancement? And I'm thinking about the example of when the Chinese came in and brought in the, and had and fostered rapprochement between the Iranians and the Saudis. That's what are your thoughts on that, and how that can be, and perhaps how that can be a successful solution to what's going on in Southwest Asia?
By Southwest Asia, you mean? Middle East. Middle East, oh, okay. You're right, you've got to find other ways and means of bringing people together. And I'm going to give you, by the way, please forgive me, my answer sounds frivolous, but it's actually very serious. Why did Southeast Asia succeeded? And I say Southeast Asia succeeded because of 3 4-letter words. One is basically, it's a 4-letter word beginning with F, is fear. We began, all of us were afraid of communist expansion, then we came together as ASEAN. Then we had luck. We had good leaders, amazingly good leaders in Southeast Asia, which is why Southeast Asia did so well. But the third 4-letter word, I'm going to spell it for you, is GOLF. And I'm serious. I want you to know that I'm serious. I played golf with my ASEAN counterparts. And I knew that if I had a difficult problem to solve, right? And I gave an example in the book, Kyung Hwa, you've seen this. Singapore proposed the idea of an Asia-Europe meeting because, Americans or Europeans talking to each other, Asians and Americans talking to each other, Asians and Europeans are not talking to each other. Singapore proposed an Asia-Europe meeting. But in those days, in 1990s, there was still some rivalry between Malaysia and Singapore. So the then Prime Minister of Malaysia, Dr. Mahathir, said, since Singapore proposed it, I will oppose it. That was the problem. So what happened? I went to ASEAN meeting, I played golf with my ASEAN counterpart, my Malaysian counterpart, Tan Sri Kamil. I played a round of golf with him, had a good game of golf, then we had a few beers. Then at the end of the beers, I said, Kamil, tolong, Malay word, help me. I said, I cannot get my promotion until you can persuade your Prime Minister to remove his objection. So Kamil, after very good friend, said, okay, Kishore, for you I'll do it. Sure enough, he spoke to his Prime Minister and removed the opposition. And that's how the first Asia-Europe meeting came about. It was a result of a golf game. And I can tell you, in a game of golf, and I know there are many distinguished golfers here, you can find out about a person's character when you watch them play golf. Once a person kicks the ball out of the rough, I know who I'm dealing with, right? So, it's amazing. So, believe me, one reason why Southeast Asia hasn't had wars is because the chiefs of armies are too busy planning the next golf game. And I'm serious. And, if you can imagine a world in which Israelis and Iranians play golf with each other, believe me, it changes the chemistry significantly. So, this is where, diplomacy, I want to emphasize, is not new. It's been around for thousands of years. Our ancestors have found ingenious ways for us to get along. And that's what we need to do. We need to go back to the old ways of compromise, of dealing with people whom you don't like, and dealing with people whom you despise. But you have to deal with them. That's what life is about. And I think it can be done, And I hope this is why people, you mentioned Southeast Asia and Middle East, the people from the Middle East should just come and visit Southeast Asia and then see that the diversity in Southeast Asia is far more than the diversity in West Asia. Most of them, as you know, have one religion, Islam. Right? We have how many different religions in Southeast Asia? Yet we get along. So we have to go back to the past and understand the wisdom of the past and bring it forward into the 21st century.
This interview features renowned Singaporean scholar Kishore Mahbubani at the Asia Society, focusing on his memoir, Singapore's Development Journey, and Diplomatic Philosophy. Combining personal experiences, Kishore recounts Singapore's miracle of growing from a per capita income of $500 to $88,000, attributing it to the Founding Fathers' long-term planning and the country's diverse and inclusive social characteristics. He emphasizes that the essence of traditional diplomacy lies in communicating and compromising with enemies, criticizing the current international community's lack of willingness to engage in dialogue. He affirms ASEAN's success stems from its consultation and consensus-building mechanism, suggesting China and the US, as well as China and India, should achieve coexistence through compromise. He expresses concern about the Middle East situation, believing the region lacks inclusiveness and willingness to dialogue. Additionally, he responds to audience questions on great power games, the UN's role, and communication between different civilizations, conveying the core views of respecting differences, long-term planning, and pragmatic cooperation.